In a world that thrives on instant results and immediate gratification, it can be incredibly difficult to embrace the concept of waiting, especially when it comes to God's timing. As believers, we often pray and expect quick answers, assuming that because we desire something, it should come to us without delay. However, God's perfect timing operates on a different timeline, one grounded in His infinite wisdom and understanding. We may feel ready for a blessing or breakthrough, but God sees the bigger picture, knowing that some things require preparation and refinement. Today, we will explore the importance of trusting God's perfect timing, the lessons learned in the waiting, and how the delays we experience are not denials, but opportunities for spiritual growth and transformation. The struggle of waiting is something that every one of us can relate to, whether we admit it or not. It's part of human nature to want things to happen now, to crave quick answers to our prayers and immediate resolutions to our problems. But waiting, especially when we don't see anything happening, can feel like an overwhelming and frustrating experience. This feeling of being in limbo, stuck in a season where things don't seem to be progressing, can cause a deep sense of confusion, doubt, and even despair. We live in a world that thrives on instant gratification, where fast food, instant messaging, and on-demand entertainment have conditioned us to expect things to happen as quickly as possible. But when it comes to God's timing, this desire for immediate results often clashes with the spiritual reality that growth, preparation, and transformation take time. While it may be tempting to measure God's response by our own clock and schedule, the truth is that God's timeline is different. We may think we're ready for something, whether it's a breakthrough in our careers, a relationship, or a personal desire, but the truth is that God, in His infinite wisdom, knows exactly when we are truly ready for what we ask. Often, we find ourselves waiting not just for an answer, but for our hearts to align with God's purpose in our lives. The emotional and spiritual strain of waiting is real. There are moments when it feels like the prayers we prayed are unheard, the promises feel unfulfilled, and we wonder why God isn't moving faster. In these times, it's easy to question whether God has forgotten us, whether He even cares about our pain, and whether the delays are a sign of His absence. We might look around and see others receiving their answers, seeing their prayers answered almost immediately, and the frustration grows even more intense. Why are they blessed, and not me? We might ask. Why does it feel like my prayers are bouncing off the ceiling, while others seem to be walking in an abundant season? The waiting makes us feel small, inadequate, or even unworthy, and sometimes it makes us question God's love and plan for our lives. What we fail to recognize in these moments is that waiting is not punishment, it is preparation. When we experience delays, we are often in the process of refining. God is working behind the scenes, shaping our character, teaching us patience, and allowing us to grow in trust. The hardest part about waiting is not just the passage of time, but the emotional roller coaster it creates. Wondering if we are on the right path, if we've missed something, or if we've simply been forgotten. These doubts and fears rise to the surface, and the longer the waiting, the deeper those feelings can go. Waiting forces us to confront our fears, our insecurities, and our weaknesses. It stretches us beyond what we think we can handle, and, in many ways, it exposes the parts of us that are still too attached to our own timing and desires. We may want to take control, to speed things up, but in doing so, we risk losing out on what God is preparing for us. It's like trying to force a flower to bloom before its time. It will never develop fully, and will likely wilt before it reaches its full potential. The struggle of waiting is also exacerbated by the silence. Silence can be one of the most difficult things to endure. When God seems silent, it can feel like we are walking alone, that our prayers are falling on deaf ears, and that we are completely abandoned. But in those silent seasons, God is still working. It is in the silence that He often does His most significant work in us. God's silence does not indicate His absence. Silence is not a sign of indifference or rejection. It is often a sign that He is preparing us for something greater. Just like a sculptor takes time chiseling away at the rough edges of a stone, God uses the silence to refine us, to break down the parts of our character that are not yet aligned with His will. In the midst of our struggle, it's easy to forget that waiting is an active process. It is not a passive state where we simply sit back and do nothing. No, waiting is a time of preparation, where we continue to trust, continue to hope, and continue to grow. Faith in the waiting is not about doing nothing. It is about remaining faithful to God's word, seeking Him continually, and trusting in His perfect plan, even when we don't see movement. The true test of faith is not when things are going smoothly, but when the answers are delayed, when we can't see how God will come through, and when all we can do is hold on to His promises. In these moments, our faith is refined and purified. The more we wait and trust in God, the stronger our faith becomes. And although waiting is difficult, there is power in the struggle. Waiting allows us to learn to lean on God fully, to surrender our need for control, and to trust that He knows what is best for us. When we are forced to wait, we are invited to trust in God's wisdom over our own. We are invited to acknowledge that His timing is perfect, that He sees what we cannot see, and that His plans for us are far greater than we can ever imagine. So, while waiting can be uncomfortable and difficult, it is in the struggle that we experience the refining work of God. In the waiting, God teaches us perseverance, patience, and trust, all of which are necessary for the journey ahead. Waiting prepares us for what's coming, and it ensures that when the time is right, we are ready to walk into the fullness of His plan for our lives. Therefore, instead of fighting against the waiting, we are called to embrace it, knowing that God is doing something deep within us. The waiting isn't wasted. It is God's way of preparing us to receive the promises He has set before us. The struggle of waiting is hard, but it is a necessary part of God's process, and in the end, it will lead to a breakthrough that will be more than worth it. The spiritual refining process during waiting is a transformative journey that often feels uncomfortable, but it is essential for our growth and alignment with God's purpose. Waiting forces us to confront ourselves and the aspects of our character that need to be refined in order for us to fully embrace the blessings God has in store. This process is akin to the refining of precious metals, where impurities are burned away in the heat of the fire, leaving behind something pure, valuable, and strong. In the same way, God uses waiting as a time to purify our hearts, remove the spiritual impurities that hinder our growth, and shape us into vessels fit for His purpose. The heat of waiting may feel intense at times, but it is in those moments of difficulty that we experience the deepest transformation. When nothing seems to be happening, and we are forced to trust in God's plan without seeing the outcome, we are being refined. It's in the silence, in the seasons of waiting when we don't have all the answers, that God's hand is most at work in us. Waiting allows us to relinquish control, to stop trying to force things to happen on our own, and to fully surrender to God's timing. This is where the refining process begins. Patience is one of the first fruits God nurtures in us during the waiting season. It is easy to be patient when things are going well, when prayers are answered swiftly, and when life flows smoothly. But patience, the kind that pleases God, is cultivated in the waiting, the moments when everything seems to be on pause, when we wonder if we are forgotten, and when it feels like God is silent. True patience is not merely about waiting for something to happen. It is about learning to trust in God's timing, to surrender our will to His, and to believe that He is working even when we don't see it. In those times when everything around us seems still, our faith is being stretched, refined, and deepened. Waiting also teaches us dependence on God. In our culture, we are taught to be self-sufficient, to rely on our own abilities, and to take control of our circumstances. However, God knows that true strength comes not from our own abilities, but from our reliance on Him. When we are waiting, we often feel helpless. We cannot make things happen on our own, and we find ourselves completely dependent on God's provision, timing, and wisdom. In these moments of waiting, God is teaching us to lean on Him fully, to trust in His ability to provide and to lead us, and to understand that we are never meant to walk this journey alone. The waiting period forces us to release our grip on the reins of our lives and allow God to lead us in the way He knows is best. This refining process also brings clarity. In the busyness of life, it is easy to be distracted, to focus on everything around us instead of on God. But in the waiting, God clears away the distractions and speaks to us in a way that is hard to hear when we are constantly on the move. It's in the quiet moments, the stillness of waiting, that we can hear God's voice more clearly. When we are waiting, God is working in us to help us see our true selves, to confront our fears, insecurities, and weaknesses, and to show us areas of our lives that need healing. It's during this time that He often reveals our deepest struggles, areas of pride, fear, doubt, or unforgiveness that we may not have recognized before. The refining process during waiting is about facing these areas head-on, allowing God to heal and restore us. Trust is another key aspect of the refining process. It is easy to trust when things are moving in the direction we want, when doors are opening, and everything seems to be falling into place. But true trust is built in the waiting. It is in those moments of uncertainty, when we do not know how or when God will answer our prayers, that our trust in Him grows. Trust is built when we choose to believe that God is good, even when we do not understand the circumstances. It is in the waiting that we learn to trust not just in God's ability to answer our prayers, but in His wisdom and goodness. God's refining work in us is often done in the most unexpected ways. We may feel uncomfortable or even frustrated during the waiting process, but these are the times when God is working behind the scenes, orchestrating everything in our lives according to His perfect will. The trials we face during waiting seasons are not meant to break us, but to shape us into the people He created us to be. It is a spiritual workout, a strengthening of our faith muscles, as we choose to trust and depend on God even when we cannot see the outcome. God allows us to go through these times to prepare us for the blessings and breakthroughs that lie ahead. The refining process is not a punishment, it is a preparation. It is a necessary part of God's plan to ensure that when the blessings come, we are ready to handle them. Think of the promises God made to His people. Many of them took years, even generations, to be fulfilled. But in the waiting, God was preparing His people. He was refining them, building their faith, shaping their character, and positioning them for the promise. Without the waiting, they would not have been ready for what God had in store. Similarly, we must trust that God is preparing us in the waiting, refining us so that we can handle the blessings He has promised us. The refining process often feels uncomfortable, but it is always for our good. It makes us stronger, more mature, and better able to handle the responsibilities that come with the blessings. God knows that if He gave us everything we wanted immediately, we might not be ready for it. It is through the process of waiting, trusting, and being refined that we are prepared to receive His best. The waiting season is not a delay, it is a divine process. It's an invitation to grow in patience, dependence, trust, and obedience. It's a season where God is working in us and through us, preparing us for the greater things He has in store. The waiting time is not wasted. It is a time of refining, growth, and transformation. As we trust God's timing and embrace the refining process, we will emerge from the waiting stronger, wiser, and more equipped to walk in the fullness of His promises. It may not be easy, but it is always worth it. Biblical examples of waiting and trusting in God's timing offer us a powerful reminder of how God's perfect plan unfolds, even when it seems delayed or obscured by our circumstances. The story of David, for instance, is a profound testament to the importance of waiting for God's appointed time. When David was anointed as the future king of Israel, he was a young shepherd, full of promise and purpose. Yet, despite the prophetic anointing, David did not step into the role of king immediately. Instead, he spent years in the wilderness, tending sheep, fighting battles, and even fleeing for his life from King Saul, who sought to kill him. For many, this might have seemed like a period of delay, even abandonment. But God was not absent. He was shaping David, refining his character, teaching him the values of humility, leadership, and dependence on God. It wasn't until David's heart was ready, through the trials, loneliness, and the waiting, that he was able to step into the fullness of his calling. When the time was finally right, David didn't just become a king. He became a king after God's own heart. His waiting period, though difficult, was not in vain. It was a crucial preparation for the kingdom that would require wisdom, grace, and strength beyond his own abilities. In the same way, God uses waiting in our own lives to refine us, to prepare us for what we cannot yet see, but is being intricately orchestrated behind the scenes. Similarly, the story of Abraham and Sarah underscores the challenges of trusting in God's timing, especially when it feels like God's promises are delayed indefinitely. Abraham was promised by God that he would become the father of many nations, but for years, Sarah remained barren. The waiting caused them both to struggle with doubt and impatience. Eventually, Sarah, who was past the age of childbearing, decided to take matters into her own hands, offering her maidservant Hagar to Abraham, resulting in the birth of Ishmael. This decision, born out of frustration and a desire to move things forward in their own timing, caused significant conflict, and the consequences of that action were felt for generations. Had Abraham and Sarah trusted God's perfect timing, they would have avoided this pain. However, in their waiting, they were learning essential lessons about faith, trust, and God's sovereignty. Ultimately, at the time when it seemed humanly impossible, God fulfilled his promise to Abraham and Sarah, and Isaac, their son, was born. God's timing, though it had tested their patience and faith, was perfect. Abraham and Sarah's waiting was not without purpose. It taught them that God's promises are not limited by human timelines or limitations. It taught them that, while waiting might be difficult, God's plans are always greater than our own, and his timing is always perfect. In another profound biblical example, the story of Noah teaches us the importance of remaining steadfast in faith during periods of waiting, especially when the world around us mocks and doubts the promises God has given. God commanded Noah to build an ark in preparation for a flood that would destroy the earth. But for years, there was no sign of rain. Noah faced the ridicule of those around him, who saw no reason to believe in what seemed like an absurd, impossible event. Yet, Noah remained faithful to God's instructions, continuing to build the ark despite the silence and the mocking, trusting that God's promise would come to pass in his timing. When the rain finally came, Noah's faith was vindicated, and the ark he had built for decades became the instrument of salvation. God used this period of waiting not only to prepare Noah, but to give him a message of hope and salvation for all who would listen. In the same way, our faithfulness during periods of silence and waiting serves as a testimony to others, and more importantly, it serves to deepen our trust in God's promises. Noah's obedience in the waiting season is a reminder that, no matter how long the wait, God's word is true, and his promises will always be fulfilled in his perfect timing. The story of Joseph is another example of waiting that teaches us about trust and divine timing. Joseph's life seemed to be full of setbacks. He was sold into slavery by his own brothers, falsely accused by his master's wife, and thrown into prison. Yet, through every painful and unjust circumstance, Joseph remained faithful to God. He did not lose heart when it seemed that the dream God had given him, of rising to a position of power and influence, was an impossible fantasy. Even in the pit of prison, God was preparing Joseph, refining his character, and positioning him for what was to come. God's timing was not early or late. It was exactly when Joseph was ready to step into the fullness of his calling. It wasn't until Joseph had been humbled, refined, and trained that he was elevated to a position of power in Egypt, second only to Pharaoh. His journey, filled with delays and difficulties, was not a mistake. It was a preparation for the greater plan that God had for him. When his brothers came to Egypt in need of food, it was Joseph, now in a position of authority, who had the power to forgive them and restore the family. God's perfect timing in Joseph's life ultimately led to the preservation of his family, the fulfillment of the dreams he had as a young man, and the saving of a nation. This story illustrates that sometimes the road to our divine purpose is long, painful, and full of setbacks, but God is never absent. He is actively working, preparing us for the moment when His promises are fulfilled. And when we look back, we will see that His timing was always perfect. These biblical examples all reveal a common thread. Waiting is a necessary process in God's plan. Whether it's David waiting for his throne, Abraham and Sarah waiting for the promised child, Noah waiting for the rain, or Joseph waiting for his dreams to be realized, each story teaches us that God's timing is not only perfect but intentional. Waiting refines us, builds our faith, and deepens our trust in God's sovereignty. It is in these seasons of waiting that we learn to depend not on our own understanding or our own abilities, but on God's wisdom and timing. Just as God worked in the lives of His people throughout history, He is also working in our lives today. We may not understand why we are waiting or why things are delayed, but we can trust that God is in control. Our waiting is not in vain. It is a process of preparation, refinement, and alignment with God's perfect will for our lives. Just like those who came before us, we must learn to trust God's timing and be patient, knowing that in His time, everything will fall into place. And when His promises are fulfilled, we will look back and see that the waiting was worth every moment, for God's timing was not early, not late, but always perfect. The dangers of rushing God's plan are far-reaching, not only in terms of the immediate consequences, but in the long-term effects they have on our faith and relationship with Him. Human nature craves control and speed, and in a world where instant gratification is the norm, it's tempting to want to force things into motion when we feel like God's plan is taking too long. We may begin to believe that we know better than God, or that we need to expedite the process to achieve the results we desire. This is where the danger lies. When we take things into our own hands, we are essentially telling God that we do not trust His timing or wisdom. The consequences of this can be dire, both for our personal growth and the fulfillment of God's promises in our lives. When we rush God's plan, we risk stepping outside of His will, which can lead to confusion, heartache, and unnecessary struggles that we could have avoided by simply waiting on His timing. One of the most powerful biblical examples of the danger of rushing God's plan comes from the story of Abraham and Sarah. God had promised Abraham that he would become the father of many nations. But after years of waiting without the fulfillment of that promise, Sarah took matters into her own hands. She gave her servant Hagar to Abraham, thinking that perhaps God's promise would be fulfilled through her. This decision, born out of impatience, led to the birth of Ishmael, but it was not God's plan. The result was a great deal of pain, conflict, and division within the family. Abraham's impatience and failure to wait for God's timing led to consequences that lasted for generations. Had they trusted God's perfect timing, they would have avoided this painful detour. Instead of rushing, if they had simply waited on God, they would have seen that His promise would come to pass in the perfect way and at the perfect time. The birth of Isaac, the child of promise, came when it seemed humanly impossible, when Sarah was past the age of childbearing. God's timing, though delayed from their perspective, was perfect, and His plan was far better than anything they could have orchestrated on their own. The lesson here is profound. When we rush God's plan, we often create our own Ishmaels, imperfect solutions that may seem good in the moment, but end up complicating our lives. and delaying the true fulfillment of God's promises. When we try to rush God's plan, we also risk missing the work that He wants to do in us during the waiting period. Waiting is not just about passing time. It's about the transformation that happens within us as we trust God's timing. Rushing through the waiting season means that we skip the refining process that God has in place for us. It's in the waiting that God molds our character, strengthens our faith, and teaches us to depend on Him. Every delay, every moment of uncertainty, and every season of waiting is designed to shape us into the people God knows we need to be for the blessing that is coming. If we rush through that process, we risk not being prepared for what God has in store. The truth is that the waiting season is often where God is doing His most significant work in us. It's where He teaches us humility, patience, trust, and obedience. When we force things to happen, we may miss out on the essential lessons that God is trying to teach us during that time. God's work in us is just as important, if not more so, than the blessings He desires to give us. If we rush through the waiting, we are essentially robbing ourselves of the opportunity for growth and transformation. Rushing God's plan can also cause us to step into situations that we are not ready for. Sometimes, we think we are prepared for a blessing or breakthrough, and because we feel ready, we try to push things along. But God sees the bigger picture. He knows what we can handle at any given moment, and He understands that some blessings require maturity and experience. If we rush ahead of God's timing, we may find ourselves in situations where we are not equipped to handle the responsibility that comes with the blessing. We may be handed something we are not yet spiritually, emotionally, or mentally prepared for, and this can lead to stress, burnout, and even failure. The classic example of this can be seen in the story of David. Although David was anointed as king as a young man, he did not immediately step into the position. Instead, he spent years learning leadership, dealing with difficult circumstances, and becoming more dependent on God. If David had rushed to claim the throne before God's timing, he might not have had the wisdom or strength to lead the nation. His waiting period, although difficult, was essential for him to become the king God intended for him to be. David's story teaches us that God's delays are not signs of denial, but of preparation. If we rush, we may end up missing the preparation that is vital for handling the blessings God has in store for us. Another danger of rushing God's plan is that it can lead us into unnecessary battles. We may feel that God's plan isn't moving fast enough, and in our frustration, we try to create our own path forward. However, when we take matters into our own hands, we often find ourselves in situations that we were never meant to be in, fighting battles that God never intended us to face. This often results in unnecessary conflict, stress, and struggle. God promises that He will fight our battles for us, that He will be our protector and provider. But when we rush ahead of Him, we take on the responsibility ourselves, and that often leads to conflict with others, or even with God. God's plan for our lives is designed to be a smooth path, but when we try to rush or force things, we encounter obstacles that were never meant to be there. The story of the Israelites wandering in the desert is a powerful example of this. They were promised the land of Canaan, but their impatience, disobedience, and lack of trust in God caused them to wander for 40 years. Their journey could have been much shorter, but their lack of faith and their attempts to force God's plan led to unnecessary delays and hardships. The Israelite story serves as a warning that when we try to rush God's timing, we end up complicating our journey and facing obstacles that could have been avoided. Rushing God's plan also causes us to miss the peace that comes with waiting. Waiting is not just about enduring a period of inactivity. It is about trusting that God is working even when we can't see it. When we rush, we take control of the situation, and that leads to anxiety, stress, and a lack of peace. But when we wait on God's timing, we can experience a deep peace that comes from knowing that He is in control, and that everything is unfolding according to His plan. God's peace is something that transcends our understanding and our circumstances. When we rush, we rob ourselves of that peace, and we replace it with worry and fear. The peace that comes from waiting is not passive. It is active trust in God's wisdom, and it's a peace that enables us to rest in the knowledge that God has everything under control. Ultimately, rushing God's plan is an expression of doubt. It is a lack of trust in His ability to fulfill His promises at the right time and in the right way. When we rush, we are telling God that we do not believe He knows what is best for us. The act of waiting, on the other hand, is an act of trust. It is saying to God, I trust that your timing is perfect, even when I don't understand it. I trust that you are working behind the scenes, preparing everything according to your will. The danger of rushing is that it reveals a heart of impatience and a lack of faith in God's timing. But when we choose to wait, we choose to trust in His sovereignty, wisdom, and goodness. And in doing so, we are positioning ourselves to receive the full measure of His blessings at the perfect time. In conclusion, rushing God's plan brings unnecessary pain, delays, and struggles. It causes us to miss the lessons of patience, trust, and dependence that God wants to teach us. It robs us of the preparation we need to handle His blessings, and it leads us into situations we were never meant to face. But when we wait on God's perfect timing, we allow Him to refine us, strengthen us, and prepare us for the future He has for us. His timing is always perfect, and His plan is always better than anything we could try to force on our own. The waiting may be difficult, but it is never wasted. It is a process of growth, refinement, and alignment with God's will. So let us trust in His timing, surrender our impatience, and rest in the peace that comes from knowing that He is in control.